Fully detailed expose, the US-EU trade war, how Trump's 200% tariff threat could reshape global markets for decades. The US and the European Union have been economic allies, trading billions, but that relationship is now on the brink of a major trade war, with President Donald Trump threatening a 200% tariff on European wine, champagne, and spirits. The move comes after the EU proposed a 50% tariff on American whiskey, escalating tensions that have been brewing for years. If enacted, these tariffs could cripple industries on both sides, spark retaliatory measures, and disrupt global markets. So, how did we get here? What's at stake? And who wins and who loses if this trade war escalates? Let's break it all down. Chapter 1. The long road to a US-EU trade war. While this may seem like a sudden escalation, tensions between the US and the EU over trade have been simmering for years. The conflict originated with tariffs imposed under Trump's first presidency, when the US placed steep duties on European steel and aluminum, citing national security concerns. In response, the EU retaliated with tariffs on American bourbon whiskey, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and Levi's jeans. By 2021, the Biden administration attempted to ease tensions, negotiating a temporary truce that suspended tariffs on some goods. But now, with Trump back in power, those negotiations have collapsed, and both sides are preparing for another round of economic warfare. The latest flashpoint? Alcohol tariffs. The EU announced a 50% tariff on American whiskey to protect its domestic markets. In retaliation, Trump threatened a 200% tariff on European wine, champagne, and spirits, a move that could devastate European producers. The question now is, will these threats become reality, or is this just another high-stakes negotiation tactic? Chapter 2. The economic fallout. Who gets hit the hardest? If these tariffs are imposed, the consequences could be severe for both the US and the EU. European wine industry faces disaster. The EU exports $5 billion worth of wine and spirits to the US annually. A 200% tariff would make European wine unaffordable for most American consumers, drastically cutting demand. French champagne, Italian prosecco, and Spanish wine would be the hardest hit, with major vineyards already warning of financial ruin. American whiskey industry also at risk. The EU's 50% tariff would make US whiskey dramatically more expensive in Europe, hurting brands like Jack Daniel's, Jim Beam, and Maker's Mark. The American whiskey industry relies on the EU for 30% of its exports, making Europe one of its largest markets. US consumers would pay the price. Imported wine, champagne, and whiskey prices in the US would skyrocket, forcing consumers to pay more or switch to domestic brands. Distributors, restaurants, and bars would suffer, as they rely on European imports to meet demand. Chapter 3. The political fallout. How this affects US-EU relations beyond economics. This trade war could permanently damage US-EU diplomatic relations. France's response. French Prime Minister François Bayrou has called for de-escalation, stating that the EU may have overreacted by targeting American whiskey. Germany's stance. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has urged the EU to negotiate, fearing an all-out trade war would hurt European industries. The EU's official position. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has defended the EU's tariff plan, arguing that the US started the conflict by imposing steel and aluminum duties years ago. The US position. Trump has doubled down, arguing that Europe has been ripping off American industries for years and that it's time to level the playing field. This dispute isn't just about alcohol, it's about power, politics, and who controls global trade. Chapter 4. The global impact. How this affects other nations. This trade war isn't happening in a vacuum. It could spark broader global economic disruptions, including stock market turbulence. Markets hate uncertainty. The fear of tariffs could cause major volatility in global stock exchanges. China watching closely. China, already in a trade war with the US, could exploit this rift by offering better trade deals to Europe. Canada and Mexico caught in the crossfire. As key trading partners, both nations could face economic spillover effects from the dispute. The IMF's warning. The International Monetary Fund has cautioned that escalating trade tensions could slow global economic growth, particularly in Europe. If neither side backs down, this won't just be a US-EU issue, it could disrupt trade worldwide. Chapter 5. What happens next? So, where does this all lead? There are three possible outcomes. 1. The US and EU strike a deal. Best case scenario, both sides agree to drop or reduce tariffs in exchange for new trade agreements. This avoids major economic damage and prevents further escalation. 2. The trade war escalates. Most likely scenario, the US imposes its 200% tariff, and the EU retaliates with more tariffs. Prices soar, businesses suffer, and relations between the US and Europe deteriorate. 3. A full economic breakdown. Worst case scenario. The trade war spirals into a broader economic crisis, with both sides imposing harsh sanctions and restrictions. This could lead to wider global instability, including market crashes and recessions. Final thoughts. What this means for the future of this dispute isn't just about alcohol, it's about the future of international trade. If these tariffs happen, they could reshape global economics for years to come. The world is watching. The question now is, will Trump and the EU find common ground, or are we witnessing the start of a full-scale economic war? Follow Rethink Report for the full story.